Welcome, everyone. Before we get started, we have an announcement about Spanish interpretation for this webinar.
Hello to everybody. My name is Angelina and I'm here with Murtado with Full Circle Interpreting. We'll be providing Spanish interpretation during today's session. If you would like to hear in Spanish, please select that in your controls for Zoom. There should be a little world icon that then takes you to Spanish. Or you can also open this through the three little dots that open up more options in your control panel for Zoom. Hola, bienvenidos a todos. Espero que estén teniendo una linda tarde. El día de hoy estaremos ofreciendo servicios de interpretación al español. Por favor, seleccionen el canal de español yendo a sus controles de Zoom, presionándolo el icono terráqueo y luego pueden escoger español. Si están en un teléfono o un celular, esta opción está ubicada abajo a mano derecha. Pueden presionar los tres puntos que abren un menú desplegable. Ahí encontrarán interpretación, luego español y luego finalizar. Gracias y que tengan una gran reunión. Okay, Andy, I've made the announcement. I will also post this in the chat, and I hope you have a great session.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for joining us today for another installment of the Southern Ag Exchange Network Applied Research Webinar Series. Today, we are honored to present a talk by Dr. Chris Morris, Postdoctoral Research Associate in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Iowa State University. Dr. Morris has published peer-reviewed articles and extension briefs on conservation and has integrated that environmental emphasis into his examination of farm stress. Currently, Dr. Morris is the co-chair-elect of the Sociology of Agriculture and Food Research Interest Group at the Rural Sociological Society, and I am very excited to have him here today. Audience, please use the Q&A function to communicate. You can ask questions at any time during the talk with that function. I will catalog the questions for after the talk. All right, over to you, Dr. Morris.
Thank you so much, Andy. And I just want to say thank you to you and the Southern Ag Exchange Network for inviting me to present my work today. I always appreciate the opportunity to share my research. And as I'm bringing up my presentation, I just want to say I'm also grateful to all of you for attending today's webinar, choosing on a Friday afternoon to listen to someone talk about trauma. So there will be some heavy elements of this discussion, and I do want to give a content warning that I will be talking about suicide, but I think these are important things that we need to discuss in terms of farming and agriculture and farmer well-being, and I appreciate you all being interested in the subject. So hopefully everything is showing up okay. My title is called Beyond Stressed: The Effects of Trauma on Farmers, Their Communities, and Sustainability Outcomes. Just to give you a little bit of background as far as where I come from. So originally I'm from Texas. My grandparents on both sides of my family were farmers and ranchers, but those properties were sold before I was able to inherit anything. But I grew up working on farms and ranches, and I was always interested in where my food comes from and interested in the field of agriculture. And I took that interest to Montana State University, where I earned my bachelor's in range science, which, for those of you who don't know, is basically a degree that combines agriculture, wildlife management, conservation, and has a heavy emphasis on livestock grazing. Excuse me. After that, I moved back down to Texas, where I worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture Natural Resources Conservation Service as a rangeland management specialist for 15 years. So I made a career out of that. I worked in a field office, actually 3 different field offices around Texas, and worked with farmers developing conservation plans and administering conservation financial incentive programs. Over the course of those 15 years, I became really interested in how the human dimension of the work that I was doing affected natural resource outcomes on the land. One thing that they don't really tell you in the beginning is that when you're working in natural resources, a huge part of your job is understanding people. And I thought it would be really interesting to take my experience with the NRCS and working with farmers and apply that to conducting research, so I could further our understanding of what factors influence farmer decision making. And I also felt a calling to teach the next generation of conservation practitioners like myself. And so I heard about the Sustainable Agriculture program at Iowa State University, and learned that I could co-major with rural sociology. So this was an opportunity to really combine natural sciences with social sciences. And my major professor was Dr. J. Arbuckle. I was really interested in his work, and I was excited to be accepted into the program. I realized I need to update this slide. I earned my master's in 2020, and I did, in fact, graduate and earn my PhD in 2023. And now I'm working as a postdoc here at Iowa State University. So I have my hands in a lot of different types of research. I look at, in general, factors that influence farmer adoption of conservation practices. So I work with the Iowa Farm and Rural Life Poll, which is a panel survey that's been going on since 1982. I also work with the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, looking at factors that influence farmer adoption of water quality practices. I work with on the Sea Change Grass to Gas project, which is looking at the feasibility of using anaerobic digestion of perennial forages and manure to produce renewable natural gas. I helped co-develop the Conservation Practitioner Poll, which was an inaugural survey in cooperation with the Soil and Water Conservation Society, basically a survey of conservation practitioners across 6 different states. And a big part of my dissertation research, which I'll be talking about today, dealt with experiences of farmer trauma and how those experiences affect decisions. So in general, so again, my work is going to be focused on Iowa, but I think a lot of the core tenets of what I learned from my research can be applicable to any region. So here in Iowa, we have a lot of specialization and industrialization of the agricultural industry, and that's led to some adverse impacts on soil, water, and other natural resources. The good news is that there are conservation practices that can address these issues. However, adoption rates of these conservation practices isn't where it needs to be to meet our natural resource goals, and we're still working on why that is. So at least I have some job security. So there are these environmental issues with sustainability outcomes, and there's also some socioeconomic issues related to this model of agriculture. We know that rural communities are declining in population, that the economics of agriculture for many farmers are not penciling out. We have a lot of farmers who are getting out of agriculture, and farms tend to get fewer in number and larger. And there's also some mental health aspects, which, this group has definitely addressed before. I thought that this illustration was interesting. Quote says, "They maintain their tractors, they maintain their pumps and everything, but they don't maintain themselves," talking about farmer mental health. And then, of course, we know that farmers are at risk, disproportionate risk compared to general society for dying by suicide. So I started thinking about maybe there might be a connection between all of this, between these environmental outcomes and these socioeconomic outcomes, and what that might have to do with trauma. So these first 2 books, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk and Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman, were recommended to me by family members who deal with both physical and emotional trauma. And as I was reading these books, I recognized in the stories that they were telling about people who had experienced trauma, a lot of symptoms and similar stories with farmers that I had worked with in Texas with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I wondered if there might be a connection. And then I found this book by Kai Erikson called Everything in Its Path, which documented a phenomenon that he referred to as collective trauma, where trauma is not only experienced by individuals, but as a group. And I wondered if this could be applied to Iowa farmers. So collective trauma refers to the psychological effects experienced by a group of people in response to a shared traumatic event. It's been used to describe things like natural disasters, wars, genocide, racism, and most recently the COVID-19 pandemic, and it can work at multiple scales. So how this relates to farmers is that they represent a unique population that basically gets exposed to potentially traumatic events on a regular basis. So things like floods, droughts, tornadoes. Recently, we had a derecho in Iowa, and all of these types of natural disasters can wipe out, your income. Also, we had the 1980s farm crisis, which was incredibly traumatic. That's been written about before. As I mentioned before, declining rural communities, that farmer chronic stress, which is something that is gaining more attention now, and the high risk of on-farm injuries and deaths, as well as farmer suicides. So the effects of collective trauma can be wide-ranging, but some of the main tenets are that you get damages to the relationship bonds and a sense of community. You can find a breakdown of trust between individuals and also between individuals and institutions. And you can have an altering of collective memory and identity. These experiences of collective trauma can further instances of collective trauma. So trauma begets trauma. And these effects can also be intergenerational, which is something I'll talk about in a second. So those are effects at a collective level. On an individual level, people can have diminished perceptions of behavioral control, so they feel like less likely to be able to have agency in their lives. These experiences can alter social norms. They can cause difficulty in making decisions. They can both increase perception of risk, so they're increasing how people who are affected think things are risky, and they also increase the aversion to that risk. So they tend to perceive more risk, and they tend to be more likely to not want to engage in that risk. So there are some coping mechanisms, both good and bad, that people use for these experiences of trauma on an individual level, self-care, working through the problems on their own, also seeking social support and seeing a therapist for mental health issues can all be effective. At the community level, education and outreach is really important. Creating stakeholder action groups so that you feel like you can move past a trauma by taking action with those that were affected with you, and then group therapy. And personal resilience is also a big factor, which is, that's determined by a wide variety of background factors. So in this particular project, which was funded by a SARE grant, I wanted to know, in what ways have Iowa farmers and their communities experienced events and conditions that could be described as collective trauma? How do farmers themselves characterize these experiences, and how have these experiences affected their communities? How have these experiences affected farmer decision-making with regard to how they manage their farms? And then how have those decisions in turn affected the sustainability outcomes that I mentioned earlier? And finally, what types of trauma-informed policy changes or outreach efforts might be effective for helping farmers and their rural communities respond to these incidences of collective trauma and potentially then improve those sustainability outcomes? So the way I went about doing this research project is I conducted interviews in the field with farmers for all across the state of Iowa. So I conducted 16 in-depth interviews. These all took from about an hour and a half to 2 hours, met with farmers often in their kitchens over a cup of coffee. And the way they were selected was we looked at participants from the 2020 and 2021 waves of the Iowa Farm and Rural Life Poll, who looking for participants that had indicated that they had experienced either extreme flooding or drought, a decline in their quality of life, or negative outcomes from this transition from more diverse to a more specialized system of agriculture. We hadn't actually asked any questions about trauma at this point, and so this was just a way to potentially get to farmers that may have experienced something potentially traumatic. But I also wanted to talk to behavioral health experts that really understood the mental health of farmers. And so I also conducted 5 interviews with behavioral experts. And so these were researchers, extension specialists, and therapists who specifically have experience working with farmers on their mental health to get an idea of what might be occurring with these farmers in their communities. And it was important for me to learn from them the best practices that I should use in these interviews with farmers so as not to do further harm or re-traumatize farmers. So then out of all these transcripts, I analyzed them using a grounded theory approach, which basically, if you're not familiar, means I let the data speak for itself. I look for emergent themes and then organize those themes into variables to explain how a phenomenon is occurring. And so I'm going to go over some of the results. My chapter in my dissertation on this work was quite long, and it would probably take at least a couple of hours to go through every single theme. So I won't be doing that. I won't take up your entire Friday afternoon for that. So I'm just going to focus in on a few of these themes to help you understand kind of the basics of what I found. And I would be happy to share this information with anyone else who might be interested. So first, talking about how we conceptualize trauma in agriculture. This quote is from a behavioral health expert who says, in the agricultural context, stress is the norm. Farmers are stressed by weather, markets, what's happening in Washington, D.C., and all of that's normal. But trauma is something that threatens the existence of their farm. So trauma is interest rates being raised to 20% or more and having huge debt. Trauma is a spring that's so wet that their calves are literally drowning in the mud. Trauma is the flood that threatens the existence of their farm, or the drought that goes on so long they can't see to the other side. So that's the difference between stress and trauma. Stress is normal. Trauma is the moment when you look at the situation and you think, I don't know how to get out of this. And so this is why I titled this presentation Beyond Stress. I think that stress in farming is incredibly important to talk about, and I'm so glad that there's more attention being devoted to this. But I also think it's important to note that there are things that are potentially occurring with farmers that do go beyond the experience of stress. So here's a farmer who's talking about his experience after falling off of a grain bin and having an injury associated with that. So he says, now my emotions are boiling to the surface, just like my grandfather who suffered a severe stroke. He talks about he finds that after this fall, some of the smallest things would just get him all choked up. And he thought that as the years went by, that would subside, and it hasn't yet. So he called his experience traumatic and talked about the emotional response that elicited. And so there's what things can be traumatic in the agricultural industry. So one big thing that came up is physical threats. This is a farmer talking about his experience after the derecho that I mentioned, which is basically an inland hurricane. He says the buildings are gone, the bends and the trees are gone, the crop is destroyed. And I had this first shock of, this was unfortunately his first year with a new farm that was owned by his father-in-law. And so not only did he have this devastation to his livelihood, he had this emotional response of, I wasn't able to hold it together in my first year managing my father-in-law's farm. And he said that he felt helpless. And then while he was actually clearing the debris out of his field, he talks about instances of high heart rate, almost feeling panicked. And he said just feeling completely drained after that. I had a lot of farmers talk about symptoms of panic, about loss of sleep, staying up and walking the floors, being worried about the stress of farming. And so again, these are things that seem to speak to potentially traumatic symptoms. This is a farmer talking about drought, saying, actually talking about flooding. So some guys say drought is so bad, and it is, but growing up in our type of topography, nothing scares me more than a gully washing rainstorm. He says that you get a 6-inch rainfall in an hour, and it takes half of your farm down the creek, and you can never get that back, and it scares me to death. So talking about watching your farm wash away as something potentially traumatic. So in addition to physical threats that farmers face, there's also financial threats. This Southeast Iowa farmer calls it a roller coaster that you just have to get used to. He says, we gamble every single day. We don't have to go to a casino. The market can be up or down, and that might mean gaining a few $1,000s a day or losing a few $1,000s in a day. So never knowing exactly what your income is going to be as a farmer and having these wide swings of gains and losses. And another farmer had a really pointed quote. He said, for me, it seems like I've always been just hanging on. And he put his hands up to indicate just barely hanging on by his fingertips. He says sometimes the grip was a little bit better, but he wonders if he's just that poor of a businessman. But there have been an awful lot of years of we just barely made it, or maybe this year wasn't too bad. And there hasn't been a lot of, okay, you really got that one right. And interestingly, at the end of the interview, I asked every farmer, in order to kind of end on a high note, what's something that they looked forward to in the future. And this particular farmer, to paraphrase, said, basically, I look forward to getting out of farming so that I don't have to worry about if this year is going to be the year that I lose everything. So physical threats, financial threats, and then there's threats to the actual community. So as I mentioned, we're seeing these patterns in rural communities of population loss. This farmer says the population dwindled, the class sizes dropped in half. So you start to see community institutions like churches and schools closing. And then this farmer, they lost their grocery store. So this is a farmer who's producing food, but living in a food desert. He had to go to the next county over to actually get food. And then another farmer who is also an agronomist says he visits lots of farmers. And one of the big conversations that comes up is that I don't get along with my sister or my brother or a sibling or a son because of farm transitions. So that came up a lot. A lot of farmers talked about a traumatic experience being maybe they didn't talk to one complete side of their family because of arguments over the land, how it should be managed, how it should be parceled up to the next generation, and really causing a breakdown in community and family dynamics. And then in particular with these community dynamics, there was a lot of talk about the 80s farm crisis. This farmer talks about how the 80s were really rough. I won't read this entire quote, but he talks about going into the bank. His bank failed, and in trying to manage the fallout of that, he had to go through this process of the banker scrutinizing every single purchase that he had made. And on top of that, the banker would brag that he had a gun in the drawer, because there were instances in Iowa of farmers coming in and shooting bankers after they had been foreclosed on. So yeah, incredibly traumatic experience for that farmer. So how are these things affecting farmer decisions? This particular farmer, who was a child in the 80s and didn't actually experience that firsthand, or he didn't really understand what was happening at the time, he said that he wanted plant cover crops on 100% of his acres. But he said that 80s mentality is there. Like, you can't waste money on cover crop seed when that money could go to pay debt or capitalize new assets. And so he said, I kind of had that experience of the 80s farm crisis impacting me also. He later described kind of having his father's voice in the back of his head. So this is an instance of intergenerational trauma, the trauma affecting the father, but then being passed on to the son and affecting his farming decisions. But traumatic experiences don't necessarily have to result in negative outcomes. The second quote here shows a farmer who talks about, again, the trauma of watching your farm wash away and wanting to have the next generation be able to inherit that farm. And he said that this was the impetus for him actually establishing conservation practices. So the effects can go different ways depending on the individual farmer. So I want to wrap this up. This is a really busy diagram, but it's kind of a summary of everything that I learned. So again, farmers described physical threats like extreme weather events, on-farm injuries. They also talked about livestock disease and death, and this soil erosion all being potentially traumatic threats. We have community threats, so family, interfamily turmoil, farmer suicides. Every farmer that I talked to had a story about another farmer or person in their community that had committed suicide. This erosion of community over time, and particularly things stemming from the 80s farm crisis, all of these being community threats that are potentially traumatic. And then financial threats, so these thin profit margins that almost every farmer has to deal with, these markets that can go up and then crash, without much notice. The continuing rising cost of inputs for doing the business of farming, and then the risk of bankruptcy and foreclosure. This risk of bankruptcy and foreclosure was particularly intense because farmers described to me as really being as tying their identity with the land that they farmed. So the threat of losing the farm was not just about them losing a job or potentially letting their current family down. If they lost the farm, they felt like they would be letting down generations of their family members that owned this farm before them. And so that's a huge weight and amount of pressure that I think tends to make everything, every other stress, even that much more of a hardship. So I call all of these threats potentially traumatic because not every farmer that experiences these threats actually gets traumatized. Now, I want to be really clear that I'm not a psychologist. I was not diagnosing farmers with PTSD or anything like that. I was just, again, trying to catalog their experiences. And if they called it trauma, or if they were describing symptoms that are associated with a traumatic experience, I think there's a case there to be made that it's potentially traumatic. Around each farmer, that what really affects whether a farmer is traumatized or not is this sort of buffer zone. And so the items in this buffer zone are things like debt level, the amount of personal resilience the farmer has, whether what their land ownership tenure looks like. Do they own the majority of their land? Do they lease the majority of their farmland from other farmers? How much community support they have, whether or not they have crop insurance or other conservation programs, off-farm income. So all of these things can affect whether these different types of threats actually become traumatic to the farmer. And so certain things will increase the strength and size of this buffer. Like if you have very high debt, that's going to decrease the size and strength of the buffer. But then if you have good community support or access to professional behavioral health assistance, that's going to increase the strength and size of this buffer from these threats. So these threats then are filtered through this buffer and the farmer and affect management decisions. So I mentioned the dynamics of conservation adoption. These type of threats also influence whether or not a farmer chooses to be more diverse in their operations, whether or not they grow their farm and acquire other farms to add more acreage, how they spend their money. That's another management decision that came up. So if a farmer went through the 80s farm crisis and had a high amount of debt, and maybe didn't have substantial off-farm income, all of those things would combine together to make that farmer much more financially conservative. And so they're not going to invest in things like, they're not going to be as likely to invest in things like conservation practices, or maybe they wouldn't necessarily go to their local co-op to market their farm products. They want to get the best price. Same for inputs. Excuse me. So I saw a lot of farmers saying, we can't necessarily invest in our local community because we have to go elsewhere to get a better price on things. So all of that is to say, these management decisions then have an effect on sustainability outcomes. Whether or not you adopt conservation practices is going to have an effect on environmental sustainability. How much your spending patterns are going to affect economic sustainability, and then your relationship with the rest of your community, if it's been affected by things like these community threats. If you've had an erosion of community, that's going to affect things like social sustainability. And so all of these outcomes then cycle back into these threats and kind of perpetuate this cycle of trauma and its effects on sustainability outcomes. And so really quickly here, just to give you my final conclusions, what do we do about this? So the behavioral health experts that I spoke with, their number one recommendation was increasing resources that would increase the size and strength of that buffer that I mentioned around farmers. And so what that looks like, in their opinion, is trauma-informed therapy services in rural communities. And so again, I want to differentiate that between stress. There are stress management techniques that are very important for farmers and all of us to learn. But if a farmer has actually gone through something that can be described as traumatic, that's going to take a special kind of intervention to help them work through. So trauma-informed therapy, developing communities of support for farmers to process the trauma that they've gone through. Most farmers are very stoic and individualistic, and maybe not, they don't necessarily want to talk about their problems, but if they do have opportunities to engage with other members of their community that understand what they've gone through, that can have a very positive impact on their mental health outcomes. And behavioral health experts also said we need to train professionals who work with farmers. So this would be folks like myself, who used to work for the NRCS, or agronomists, or crop advisors, or bankers, people who work with farmers, who understand this trauma dynamic and can help reduce the stigma of behavioral health issues, and potentially encourage farmers who need it to get professional help. So what did farmers say that they wanted to help this overall pattern? A lot of them would like to do something different, but they feel locked into a treadmill of production. They feel like they don't really have a choice to do things in any other way. If they want to be more diverse, they definitely need more infrastructure. So this would be things like developing markets and infrastructure to develop a diverse set of crops and livestock that in many areas they just don't have access to. A lot of them spoke to the power of ag corporations to both set the price of the market value of their products, as well as those that set the price for their inputs. Basically, most farmers feel like they're being choked at both ends. The increasing cost of inputs and in certain times decreasing prices that they're getting for their commodities are making them squeezed in, and a lot of farmers recognize that is controlled at a corporate agricultural level, and they want to see some change there. And a lot of them are honestly not happy with the current subsidy structures that they get. Almost all of them use crop insurance, but they wish that they didn't have to rely on those type of subsidies to be successful in farming, to make that necessary income. They would like to see restructured. They also feel like these decisions about subsidies are being made at a level far above their community level, and they would like more input into how those things work. So that's all I have to talk about. I just want to acknowledge, again, the Iowa Farm and Rural Life Poll that certainly informed this project, as well as the grant from North Central SARE. And at this point, I would be happy to take any questions.
I must say, I really appreciate just the level of depth that you brought to this examination of farm stress. That diagram that you had in the conclusions, its systematic approach, I think really gives us a lot to unpack. We have a question in the chat, and others, please place those questions in, and we'll ask Dr. Morris each one of them. And then I also have some of my own questions if time permits. Dr. Henricks first says, thanks, Chris, for a super informative presentation. And then asks, can you say a bit more about the patterns you observed in which farmers you interviewed expressly used the language of trauma? Any patterns in individual farmer characteristics, farm characteristics, or even regional (parentheses Iowa) farming context for them? And I'd like to add, if you could also, for the audience, just kind of provide maybe an overview discussion of Iowa farming.
Yeah, great. So there's a lot there I could talk about. Now, I appreciate the question. So overall in Iowa, it's a commodity-based farming industry. We basically grow two main crops. That's corn and soybeans. There's also a lot of livestock production. We're a leader in the production of dairy, pork, chicken, eggs. And so you have a lot of those main commodities. There's not a whole lot of diversity other than that. And again, as far as crops, it's basically corn and soybeans. And there's even some farmers out there that just grow corn on corn year after year. So, and there are some differences, and there's a few regional differences, but I think that's beyond the scope of this topic. In terms of trauma, so I wanted to be very careful in talking to farmers because there's a lot of stigma around mental health and trauma, I think even more so. And so in the beginning of these interviews, I actually didn't even bring up the term trauma myself. I kind of eased them into discussing the history of their farm, their connection to their farm. We talked about successes that they had experienced over their farming tenure. And then I got into, okay, let's talk about the hard times. And I used that term hard times or difficult times, and that sort of opened up a discussion revolving around these incidences that went beyond stress to potentially be traumatic. Many farmers actually brought up the word trauma. They would say, yeah, so that was actually something that was pretty traumatic. Or one farmer said, I probably have a little PTSD from that. Some farmers didn't talk about trauma specifically, but they certainly talked about some of the main symptoms of having experienced a traumatic incident. So having reoccurrent panic attacks when they're reminded of the situation that was traumatic, having nightmares around associated with the event. avoiding thinking about this difficult time if they didn't have to, because it would be so painful for them. Emotional dysregulation related to the traumatic event, and things like that. So, and then with some of them, depending on how comfortable I felt with them and trying to judge their level of comfort, again, not wanting to do any harm in these interviews, sometimes I would just ask, do you think what you experienced is traumatic? Are you familiar with that phrase? I remember one farmer in particular. He was talking about the 80s farm crisis, and I said, would you describe that experience as traumatic? And he said, hell yes, it was traumatic. So that's how it came up in the context. I don't think the data really show whether trauma in this case was associated with particular demographics such as farm size, farm type, and things like that. Definitely something I want to continue looking at, though.
Thank you for that really thorough response. The next question that we have is, based on your research and conclusions, did you see any positive results? And by this, they mean from going to therapy, for example.
Yeah, so most farmers didn't talk about therapy, but a couple did. And one farmer in particular talked about going to a therapist. He had experienced some depression, specifically from that community breakdown that I had mentioned, where he was cut off from an entire branch of his family because of disputes about how the farm should be managed. And he went to therapy and was able to work through that. So I thought that was amazing. He volunteered that information, which I thought was interesting. A couple of other farmers mentioned therapy, but not necessarily talking about whether or not they had gone to therapy, but they brought up the stigma of therapy, and they said that, you don't go to a therapist in your town because other farmers will see your truck parked in the driveway and they will know that you're going to therapy. So if you do go to a therapist, you go to the next town over, so that hopefully no one will know who you are. So really highlighting that stigma that I think is so prevalent in rural communities, and something that I think having these conversations about farmer mental health and well-being, I think is so important to help reduce that stigma, so that farmers and anyone in rural communities, and actually anyone in general, if they realize that they need some extra help, that they can go to a behavioral health expert, so a therapist or something like that. That's a message that I definitely try to promote. Being a human is hard, so if you need it, go to therapy.
Like to echo that. Very important. And actually, this is a good seg into this next question, where Barbara asked, did your research suggest a gender bias in terms of more openness to discuss mental health? And they provide some context to their question. Here in North Carolina, women farmer friends were more willing to address this issue and take action by establishing therapy groups and also obtaining funding from NC Farm Bureau to address this issue.
Yeah, that's a really important point. There definitely is a gender dynamic related to mental health in general in rural farming communities. So one important thing to mention is that the majority of the farmers that I interviewed were male, because the majority of farmers in the Iowa Farm and Rural Life poll are male, because the majority of farmers in Iowa are male. I think that non-male and female farmers are underreported a lot of times, actually. They're understanding how farms work. A lot of times it's labeled as a farmer and his wife, But what we really know is that there are two farmers in that family, and they just maybe have different roles, or maybe even they don't have different roles. But they only get reported as one farmer. So specific to your question, the female farmers that I talked to were really open about talking about mental health issues, and were willing to elaborate on that. That's not to say that all of the male farmers weren't comfortable going there, but I would probably reasonably say that the male farmers were more reticent to talking about it, and we know in general that that women are more comfortable talking about mental health and things like that. And so a lot of that again comes from there's some toxic masculinity there with males in general being conditioned to say, you know, I just got to pull myself up by my bootstraps and get through this on my own. I don't need any help. And that's supposed to be symbolic of you know, being a well-rounded man. And what that actually leads to is higher incidences of mental health issues, higher rates of dying by suicide, and definitely something that we need to overcome.
So I have a question, and in terms of your results and conclusions, so you talked about this a bit. Climate appears as a major stressor due to its impacts on crops, equipment, and infrastructure. As well, conservation practices are increasingly demanded of farmers, both in terms of adapting to changes in climate and from social forces like governing institutions and the general public. Could you elaborate further on how this dynamic link between production practices and climate condition farm stress, and also about whether or not adopting conservation practices can alleviate farm stress?
Yeah, wow, that's Andy, that's really great. I'll try to muddle through this as best I can and try to stay on topic, because there's definitely a lot there. So yeah, so a huge stressor of farmers are these climate-based events, which we know are tending to get worse and more erratic due to climate change. Whether or not the farmer, any individual farmer, believes in human-influenced climate change or not, most farmers definitely agree that the climate is changing and becoming less predictable and more erratic, and that's causing more stress, especially when these climate events are doing more damage than they would have necessarily in the past. So it is the case that some farmers, as I mentioned, because of these traumatic incidences, some of them will not be as likely to adopt conservation practices because of the financial and management and social risks associated with doing that. And then some of them will be the thing that actually gets them to adopt conservation practices. And so I think it would be great to do a study on how conservation agriculture and sustainable agriculture have served as ways of addressing trauma in farmers, because in a lot of ways, farmers that adopt these practices feel like they are reducing the risk on their farm by diversifying, by putting more land in perennial grass so that it's less likely to erode, by using things like cover crops, maybe moving to no-till and things like that, so that their farm is more sustainable. That reduces risk, and that's better for their mental health. I think that would be something to look at further. Did that answer your question even a little bit?
It did, very much so, and I'm with you here in that future question, right, as a place where research can go, and then also, and the diagram that you put forward, like I said, being very systematic, is understanding like mental health is not just like a thing unto itself, right? And
Yeah.
so, how do you take that systematic view and start linking up, conservation practices with an understanding also of farm finance, and then linking that to farm stress. So what you put forward, I think, is just an excellent way of that systematic thinking.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the big findings from this work is that there are potentially traumatic events that farmers are experiencing, that at least some of the farmers are being traumatized in some way from it, and that trauma is being transferred to the land itself. And I think that that's a new direction that I want to go with my research, is looking at how that trauma is manifested on the land, how the current system of agriculture is perpetuating that trauma of individuals and the land, and what do we do to address that. And I also want to talk about the fact that most of the farmers were white male landowning individuals, and that doesn't mean that they can't be traumatized, but it does mean that they have usually more resources available to them. There are certain populations in agriculture, such as migrant workers, immigrant farmers, international farmers, women farmers, farmers of color, LGBTQIA plus farmers, that have all of these same stresses and potentially traumatic factors. And then on top of that, other aspects of their identity that can, be even further traumatic. And so that's another direction I want to go with my research, is talking to those types of farmers and hearing their stories and passing those on.
Well, and actually to that point, and we'll call this the last question. There was a question here of, did you get any chances to talk with farm workers as a part of your research, i.e. do not own the farm they work on? Or do you know any statistics on their trauma mental health outcomes, whether in relation to sustainable practices or not?
It's a great question. Simple answer is no. All of the farmers that I spoke with owned at least a portion of the land that they farm. I didn't interview any farm workers, but that's definitely a direction I want to go, and I appreciate the interest in it. Off the top of my head, I don't have any statistics that I could share with any reasonable confidence, but I do know that that's an area that has been previously unexamined, and it's something that more researchers like myself are starting to look at, and I look forward to seeing some results in that area.
Great. I will just a quick response to this other question that was put out on current or future administrations funding mental health support in the Farm Bill. So the Southern Ag Exchange Network is actually the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Network for the Southern region. It is funded by the Farm Bill. And not only does it do this applied research, actually the applied research is a minimal part of the overall network. A lot of what the network is meant to do and does do is direct provisioning of resources and training around farm stress. And in the current Farm Bill debates is a provision to refund the Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Networks. There are 4 of them across North Central, where Dr. Morris is, West, Northeast, and then of course South. So I just want to put that out there, that it is in the Farm Bill and then has become an increasingly emphasized topic for not only legislatures and the executive branch, but also for organizations like Farm Bureau. Dr. Morris, I really appreciate your talk today. Thank you so much for imparting your knowledge onto our audience. We really appreciate your attendance today. I'd also like to thank Angeline and Murtado from Full Circle Interpreting for providing Spanish translation as well. And the recording of this talk will be on the Southern Ag Exchange Network website, so that you can share it out so that others can also be informed of this important issue. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much.